Right back there. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to this session on sort of how the Washington life science industry has emerged into one of the top 10 life science clusters in the country. Wanted to thank Representative Ryu over here. She was a big advocate for making this happen. See Senator Cole-Wells as well. And so thrilled to sort of tell the story and help folks think through sort of, frankly, the long journey this has been on. It's been, building a life science cluster isn't a 3 to 5 year endeavor. It's taken several decades to get there. And let me just run through that real quick, and then I will turn it over. Rather than sort of introducing everybody up front, I'm going to turn it over to folks to sort of just introduce themselves after I give a little background for those that may not be familiar with the industry, sort of where we are and sort of the trajectory over the past couple decades. So starting out, as you can see here, it's been a long journey. It's about 3 decades of growth. For 20 years or so, sort of real slow and steady. Seattle really being one of the top research clusters, then emerging in one of the top emerging life science clusters in the country, to really today being one of the top 10 clusters in the country, period. And you can see that inflection point over the last 10 years has just really taken off, outpacing job growth in Washington and outpacing life science job growth nationally. Couple things. So, obviously now top 10 cluster depends on the rankings. It's either 7, 8, 9, depending on which study you're looking at. Uniquely, and I'll come back to this in a second, we're one of the really few truly local grown industries. So almost all of our companies here started out, coming out of our research institutions and other building that talent base and then growing locally. And in terms of STEM, one of the highest concentrations of women, actually the highest concentration of women in any STEM industry in the state, almost on parity with the workforce in general, about 45, 46%. As you can see here, a panel of all women, which is wonderful to see, and a huge opportunity for folks. And then just the point down below, which is this didn't happen by accident. And I think some of I think the ones over here, our legislators are here, probably remember some of those days. But the state was very intentional back coming out of the 90s into the 2000s, supportive policy, things like an R&D tax credit. We built this thing called the Life Science Discovery Fund, which isn't here today. We've got a different fund. And it wasn't that we invested big dollars, but there was real support, and it was a sort of a joint endeavor that the state sort of made a statement saying, and you'll see this in the video from the previous governor, that this was an issue they wanted to have here and intentionally, grew. Some of that's gone away, and then we've pivoted to other things. We now have one of the top 3 cancer research funds, the NDL Cancer Research Fund here in the state, which a lot of folks don't know about, but is a huge deal that drives a lot of the cancer work here. A lot of work going on the workforce side. And then I'll talk a little bit, and Emer and others, on the entrepreneurship side as well. Just to give you a flavor, if you're not kind of familiar with the industry, we did a study, actually our PR team is the same PR team that you just heard from at breakfast with RH, they're here. So this goes back a couple of years, and really kind of try to say, what's different about kind of the Northwest in the Seattle and Washington State cluster. And, sort of 5 pillars sort of emerged from that. One, obviously quality of life, which not unique to life sciences, but obviously folks love moving to the Northwest for those reasons. We have a unique global health cluster driven by Gates Foundation and others. It's really here in Atlanta when it comes to global health leadership, both in the US and globally. And then this thing called pioneering spirit, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of folks, if you're in the industry, you think, oh, Boston and San Francisco are the big hubs, but folks here say, those are the big hubs, but that's not what we want to be. Folks here, a little more cutting edge research, really science forward, little less, so we unfortunately a little less pharma, a little more sort of biotech, but that's changing now. And so there's this real ability to sort of take some big bets, go after some really ambitious science. And as a result, it's taken decades for that to pay off, but it has. Obviously now, as I mentioned, one of the top 5 fastest growing life science regions. And then this huge sort of convergence of, the tech sector and life science sector. Now, we did a workforce study a couple of years ago. It's only Seattle and San Francisco when it comes to concentration of folks in depends how you define it, but in computational roles within life sciences. Those are the 2 leading spots here and across the world. And then sort of unique strengths, again, cell and gene therapy, really unique standout. Again, one of the top clusters in that area. The convergence of tech, which I just talked about. Again, and Margaret will sort of reference this, an incredible constellation of world-class nonprofit research institutions and universities. Global health, as I mentioned, really sort of known in the medical device industry as the home of ultrasound, and still have a ton of companies in that space, and still sort of known as a global leader in ultrasound here. And then recently, sort of this emergence in advanced manufacturing that I think BMS can talk to a little bit. Not something that many of us 10, 15 years ago would have thought, given our tax structure, but again, driven really by cutting edge innovation and really developing manufacturing for therapies that have never been done before. That has sort of emerged as another real strength here. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, really a homegrown industry. And this is unique. So a lot of other folks, states that do industrial recruitment, they'll throw millions of dollars in new manufacturing facilities, that kind of thing. Washington hasn't done that, but has made other investments. And so the result of that is almost all, if I look through I've got a board of 50 that are on our board, and almost every one of those companies started out or can trace their lineage back to a startup here, and just a few of those. So you'll hear in a little bit, Pfizer, which started out as Seagen, one of the largest deals in the world 2 years ago. The BMS footprint here, which you'll hear about, traces much of that lineage back to Juno Therapeutics. Lundbeck started as Alder. On the ultrasound side here, companies like Sonocyte, which now Fujifilm, again, started back from the old Philips and the ATL footprint. And then a ton of great local companies that are just still great local companies, but just wanted to give a little bit of that context that all this started in those evolutions, as you can see from the dates, were 20 and 25-year journeys from 2-3 person startup to global operations of global pharmas. And then just quick, and then Emer will talk a little bit more about this sort of on the entrepreneurial side. But because of that, we've really made a big investment in terms of supporting those early stage companies. Unlike tech or clean tech or other industries, most of the folks that are founders of companies, they're PhD docs, scientists, and others. They're not folks that spent their time in business school. And so really putting the support programs in place to help folks that are great scientists, researchers, clinicians, and others to pivot that into successful businesses. And so about 10 years ago, we started a program called the WIN, the Washington Innovation Network program, that is a mentoring program. So former executives mentoring those folks that are either doing startups or scientists looking to come out of the lab into transitioning that into a company. And just the results have been absolutely phenomenal. Can't take 100% credit. We built this a little bit off of an MIT model. But of 100 companies that have gone through that, about 43 have graduated, which means they've gone on to raise an initial round of fundraising. Those 43 companies have raised $3.2 billion to grow companies in Washington State. And then if you add grant funding, it's another 120 million or so. And as you can see, just we started this out on a shoestring with 5-6 companies a year. We're now at 40 companies in the program this year and continuing forward. So just an incredible success, and we partner and work with other. We can't do that alone. So you'll hear from me, right? CDL and other folks in the ecosystem that again are helping those early stage entrepreneurs transition from science into successful companies, products, and bringing a therapeutic actually to market. And so with that, I'm going to, since we got an hour and a half, we thought we did a video for our big annual conference, which is the biggest in the region each April. It was our 25th anniversary this year. So we put together a video that kind of looks at 25 years of innovation in the life science industry here. And this video sort of captures all that. Do I need to run, or can you guys run it from the back?
For decades, Washington State has broken barriers in life sciences. What started with just a few pioneers has grown into an over $40 billion industry and now ranks among the top 10 life science clusters in the U.S. It all began with groundbreaking innovation, like a University of Washington spinout that created today's ultrasound industry. And when Medic One teamed up with local device company Physio Control in the 1970s, 60 Minutes called Seattle the best place in the world to have a heart attack. Driven by a unique constellation of world-class institutions, including Fred Hutch and Seattle Children's, Washington became a research powerhouse and a leader in truly pioneering medicines.
One of Washington's real impacts is one of the first antibodies, an Enbrel, really getting going there. The first radio-labeled drugs with Corixa. The first cell therapy with Dendrion's Provenge. And so the first antibody drug conjugates coming through from Seattle Genetics. Then you're seeing, the first gene-modified cells really coming through from, Juno and a few others like that. And so there is one big difference is that capability around manufacturing and scaling novel technologies will be a lasting competitive advantage for the area.
To expand the industry's growth, the Washington Biotechnology and Biomedical Association was launched in 1989, one of the first state life science associations, now known as Life Science Washington. From there, the momentum kept building. MedTech and biotech companies launched, expanded, and punched above their weight in FDA approvals.
We were born on the battlefield. The first system that we came out was 8.5 pounds. And over time, we've continued to innovate all the way to the point where you're able to now put an ultrasound in your pocket.
We also at the time had a very supportive governor, Christine Gregoire, and she created the Life Science Discovery Fund. It was a time of tremendous innovation. We had Amazon coming up, we had Microsoft catching its tailwind when it introduced Windows in 1995. The place was humming with all sorts of startups.
I think the fact that government made a statement that we support, we're behind life sciences. We see it as an up-and-coming economic sector. We see it as an opportunity for us to join with our other research institutions that really have national acclaim. And together, we really could have a massive sector in Washington State that would be nationally and, for that matter, internationally known.
A new generation of homegrown companies emerged and pushed the boundaries of what's possible in global health. Innovators like Immunex, ICOS, Corixa, and Juno Therapeutics laid the foundation for industry giants like Amgen, Pfizer, and Bristol Myers Squibb to invest in the region, driving a surge of local manufacturing.
Started decades ago with slow and steady growth being one of the top research clusters in the United States. And then in the last 10 years, it has just taken off. Job growth here has outstripped job growth in Washington State and life science job growth nationally for the past decade, making us one of the top 10 clusters in the United States today.
To support the growing life science ecosystem statewide, Washington State University launched the state's second medical school, Elson Floyd College of Medicine, which, alongside the university district, is transforming Spokane.
There's so much innovation going on, not only in Seattle, but Spokane, Vancouver, and it's only continuing to grow.
And the breakthroughs have continued, from immunotherapy to vaccine development, protein design to genome sequencing, next-gen cell and gene therapies, and a global leading COVID response. Washington continues to lead.
When I left clinical practice and went into drug development, I realized that instead of just being able to treat one patient and one family in the clinic, I could have an effect on hundreds to thousands of patients that were suffering from cancer.
Because I was here in Seattle, I was able to get on an early clinical trial with Seattle Genetics to receive treatment. If I hadn't have been in Seattle, I would probably not be here.
As locally developed medicines were transforming patients' lives, a new generation of innovations emerged. Today, Washington State is at the forefront of the convergence between life sciences and AI, with trailblazers like Nobel laureate Dr. David Baker and cutting-edge pioneers.
We have those things being built upon this capability with artificial intelligence like what the Hutch did in cell and gene therapy, the University of Washington can be doing in AI. We're going to, I think, find an ability to put all that together, right? Novel therapeutics using novel ways of discovering both biology and also therapeutics through artificial intelligence and machine learning. And then we'll be able to make it.
This is an incredibly rich area to be able to access talent and access capabilities to be able to converge two industries together to be able to tackle massive problems.
After 25 years, we're not playing catch up. We're leading the next generation of life science innovation, fueling our economy, changing lives, and shaping the future of health right here in Washington State.
It's just one of the best places to start and grow life sciences companies. There's a great group of CEOs, there's a great group of senior leaders ready to be CEOs. There's a wonderful science infrastructure.
If we have really great science focused on really trying to make a difference for people, we'll continue to do well in building a thriving industry.
All right, thanks. That's a quick overview of 25 years or so. So now we're going to dive in a little bit with the panel to kind of talk through the details of sort of how we got there, some of our strengths. We'll also talk about some of the challenges. First, I'm just going to go through and have each panelist sort of just introduce themselves and your organizations, so have a little background and sort of where you guys are coming from, and then we'll kind of work through kind of the story of sort of how we've built this this successful cluster over the past 2 decades or so.
We'll just
I'll turn over to Evie first.
Hi, everyone. My name's Evie Ifua. I was born in New Jersey and went to college in SUNY Buffalo, studied chemical engineering and really enjoyed the interplay of chemistry and biology and math. Decided to go to Johns Hopkins for my doctorates, where I specifically just focus on cancer cell biology and aging. And so while I was in Maryland, I learned of Juno Therapeutics. I learned of the mission of cell therapy and the promise that it had for the treatments of different forms of cancers. And so decided to move here and start a career at Juno Therapeutics. Started as a scientist, and it's really interesting because we see how while cell therapy is highly advantageous, it's highly manual as we think about personalized medicine. And so that piqued my interest in being able to develop novel technologies that will allow us to reduce the costs of supporting manufacturing of cell therapy. And so I currently work in technology development. So I lead an automation team where we focus on the development of novel technologies and automation solutions that allow us to reduce the costs for cell therapy products.
And just for those folks that, without biology background, just tell me what cell therapy is.
So cell therapy is largely the capacity to engineer and to modify T cells or other immune cells within our body to be able to now recognize whether it's cancer or autoimmune diseases, really enabling your body to now have a new response to disease present in our body.
Okay, Margaret.
Good morning. My name is Margaret McCormick. I am the Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer at the BioMedical Research Institute. My Seattle life science story started at the kind of close to the beginning of Mark's graph. I moved here in 2002 and have been involved in various aspects, from being on the venture capital side to being on the CEO of different life science companies to where I'm at now at a research institute. So the BioMedical Research Institute has been around since 1956. It was originally called the Virginia Mason Research Center. In the mid-'80s, we took a shift really towards focusing on autoimmunity and immune disease in general. And at this point, our mission is to advance the science to predict, prevent, reverse, and cure immune-mediated disease. We approach this from the bench to the clinic. We have over 300 employees and do about $88 million in research every year. Over 70% of that is NIH funded. Some of the things that you may be aware of that we have been instrumental in is if any of you have had children, you realize that peanut allergy is a big deal. And it's through studies, clinical trials that our Immune Tolerance Network did probably about 10, 12 years ago, where they exposed children, like infants, to peanut very early in life, that changed the pediatric guidelines on when to actually introduce peanuts to young children. We were also very involved in the first immunotherapy ever that can delay the onset of a autoimmune disease. So teplizumab is a monoclonal antibody that is now being marketed by Sanofi that if you give it to people who are at high risk and we know will eventually develop type 1 diabetes, responders actually delay that onset for 2 to 3 years, which especially if it's for a child who is going to develop T1D, those 2 years are really critical. So, and that gives us hope, because if you can do that, then you can probably delay it longer. And eventually, hopefully, prevention is oftentimes the best therapy. We're also now, because of companies like BMS, which have really brought cell therapy to the forefront, that's also an option now for different type of autoimmune diseases. And so we are involved in companies that are developing cellular therapy to actually then reverse or cure different autoimmune diseases.
Hi, last year I'm Emer Dooley, and compared to like the backgrounds here, I'm a total mutt. I started out as a computer designer working for an American company in Ireland, moved to the US with them, came out here, did an MBA, worked for a computer telephony startup. And after that, I said, stop the world, I want to get off. So I went back to the university and basically I've worked on technology commercialization there for ever since, like almost 20 years now. You know, first of all with computer science, then with bioengineering, for a while with the Gates Foundation on a lot of their projects. And about 5 years ago, the president and provost put together this innovation roundtable, you know, with a lot of the kind of, you can imagine, big innovation people in the city who are very involved at the university, and said, you know, where is the white space? What are the really deep, and what we found out was super deep technology companies have a really hard time, you know, getting from sort of research to the market. And so the whole goal of this innovation roundtable was, how do we accelerate the innovation to impact, to societal impact? And where we saw it was, there's a lot of very early stage stuff. So we take a lot of the life science win companies. And what we do is we take 2 cohorts every year. One is around industrial AI and advanced manufacturing, you know, how we're going to change the future of manufacturing. But the other one is around, at the time, what we call computational health, exactly the stuff that people like David Baker specialize in, you know, using computing to change the future of health or medicine, whether that is, and we can talk about this as we get into it, you know, the engineering of proteins that never existed before, or at the other end, just the use of big data to change how healthcare is delivered. So we don't do devices, we don't do consumer-facing stuff in general, we don't do any apps, because our mission is to commercialize science and technology, you know, for the betterment of humankind. So that's what we do. And the way we do it is we recruit just these incredible mentors. These are people who've created, built, and exited companies. So, you know, in general, these are people, and we'll talk about some of the people later. And all we do is in 4 sessions a year, we get these startup companies together with these mentors. And the whole idea is, if you're a really deep tech founder, you have 5 million things you need to do over the next 8 weeks, and you have no idea what the 3 most important ones are that are going to move the needle. And what we say is we create this market for judgment. Like, one of the incredible things that Life Science Washington and the legislators have done here is they've created a generation of people who have created, built, and exited. Like 30 years ago, they did not exist. And so you literally had, when I moved to Seattle, you know, trying to find two lawyers who could sit across the table from each other and negotiate a term sheet was an issue. And thanks to all the work that's been done, we now have this generation of people who have created and built billion-dollar companies. And all we do is we create an incredibly structured way for them to mentor the next group. So what we do is like 4 days a year, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and dinner afterwards, they sit with these founders and they say, here are the 3 things you need to do. And at the end of the day, we have this huge, the founders leave with sort of a peer-reviewed set of objectives. And then after the founders leave the room, we turn to every mentor in the room and say, okay, who's going to raise their hand to work with them for at least 4 hours over the next 8 weeks to get there? And that's where the rubber hits the road. Like, the session days are great fun. Any of you who want to come see this, they are a blast. It's like watching 20 mini board meetings in a row. But the rubber hits the road when the mentors raise their hand. And if there's a company in the room where nobody wants to work with them, we have a discussion, we give them feedback, but they're cut. And the reason we do that is we are not trying to be Shark Tank. But the most valuable asset we have is these mentors' time. As you know, Mark, people who create and build these kinds of companies, they want to know that if they're going to do something that, so if you're 3 weeks into a relationship and you realize we're wasting everybody's time as a mentor, every 8 weeks they get to decide with their time, who do they want to work with? And from the founder's perspective, and I'll shut up then, we don't take any equity, we don't charge any fees. So because of that, the element of competition is, the person who performs best on those 3 objectives, they're the ones that people want to work with, and they're the ones who are going to stay in the program. And kind of like you, so we've just been doing this for 4 years now, but the companies that have been through the program have raised 200 million already, and are doing some very cool stuff.
Great. So let's, good overview. We're going to kind of go back. Let's kind of think through. So sort of the foundations region sort of on nonprofit research. So Marty, can you talk a little bit kind of about both how that works, regional leadership in that, and sort of this kind of uniquely collaborative environment of really having a group of research institutions that people really work together, and what that means for sort of building the foundation of the industry.
Yes, I would love to. So the Seattle area and even broader Washington has a number of world-class research institutes. I will count BRI as one of them, but with Fred Hutch, the Allen Institute, Seattle Children's Research Institute, to name a few, and of course, University of Washington. And I think historically, we have attracted more than our fair share of NIH funding because of the community and the focus on doing outstanding research. The faculty members at BRI have collaborations across the city, this country, and the world, but I mean, at least for now. But because there's so many different strengths at different places, I think that has been such a boon to this community. And as Mark was mentioning, what's resulted because of that is the industry. Like, most of the companies that are started here are started off of the research that has happened at the research institutes and the University of Washington. And that goes way back. I mean, that's not a recent phenomenon. And so I think, as we're thinking about the future, making sure we figure out a way to sustain that engine to continue, because I think, as Mark mentioned, this is not a 1 to 5 year type initiative. Most of the drugs that are coming out now were started 20 plus years ago. And it's that period of investment and trying to, create and destroy, because oftentimes you go the wrong direction for a while. You need that sustained momentum and investment, and you also need the collaboration. And so some of the fears that I have is thinking about is, the collaboration across the border has also been hugely beneficial to this region, and I have fears as to what that might look like going forward.
Yeah, and just a little context. I mean, in this region, about $1.3 billion of NIH funding, which is, and University of Washington is either 1 or 2 with Johns Hopkins on an annual basis in terms of top research dollars into the state. Then collectively, it's about 1.8 billion when you add in NSF and some other dollars. So, truly a huge driver of that. So we'll come back and talk about that a little bit in terms of federal policy and investment being an absolute critical asset there. And another point, but I'll come back to it. So let's go to Emer to talk a little bit. So again, that's this research base, this incredible base of both institutions and federal funding and others that have sort of been sort of the first step in the ladder. And as Margaret kind of talked about, bringing a therapeutic to market is not like building, you know, software or others, right? It's on average, it takes about over $2 billion in 10 to 15 years to bring a single drug to market. And usually that's, you know, that one that makes it, there's 99 that don't make it. So it's really a long, arduous process. And so you got to sort of stick with it. And so but the really challenging part is, as I mentioned in the opening, is that first step of getting from sort of the academic research to actually, you know, viable company, viable product, viable pathway. So as I said, we've done some of that work, CDL and others. So, you know, can you talk a little bit about sort of, you know, what it takes to help transition that academic research, nonprofit research, into sort of a viable pathway to market?
Yeah, and I think everybody's heard of David Baker at this stage, right? Everybody at the University of Washington has to claim some sort of relationship with him these days. But, but what David Baker did basically is, so it's a fabulous example. So the very first, he created this program for translational investigators, that is postdocs who really wanted to start a company. So this is the best example of what we're trying to replicate. So the Institute of Protein Design over the last couple of years has spun out probably 12 companies that have raised billions of dollars, but let's just take one. So the very first translational investigator to go through the Institute of Protein Design, and this is how it happens, right, was Ingrid Pulse. And she was working with a group of undergraduate students who took a project to this internationally genetically engineered machines competition. And they had a friend who had celiac disease, so couldn't tolerate gluten. And they said, what if we use the software that David Baker has created, which is this software called Rosetta, you know, to fold proteins, never mind that. But what if we took that and we designed a protein that could digest gluten and live, you know, someplace. Now, so what they did was they said, and this is how this whole idea came about. So the students computationally designed, this is why this matters, they designed it with a computer, no, you know, piece of reality in it at all. And they theoretically designed this protein that would digest gluten if you had celiac disease, and they took it and they won the competition. So Ingrid was their advisor. She starts to perfect this over the next coming year, like over 10 years, with a lot of like grant money at the University of Washington. And ultimately, you know, she got it into like, you know, the lab and into humans. And Takeda bought the company for $330 million, you know, a couple of years ago. Now, the research, or the help that she got was, first of all, she was at a top-tier research university, so she could, you know, get some institutions like WRF, you know, gave her early grant money. She got $50,000 from WRF that helped, you know, with the first lab hire that she could have. Again, another like they only invest in Washington State companies. And then she had help from an entire infrastructure that the Institute of Protein Design has built around their things. So, you know, Takeda, Yashi was, you know, one of her very first mentors was at Takeda. And what those people do is they say, okay, here's what you need to get in front of a pharmaceutical company. And he also brokered the deal for Takeda, actually funded her phase 1 trials and her phase 2 trials. And then when the phase 2 trials were promising, they bought the company. But what you do is you just create an environment around all of these founders to say, A, it's possible, here are the people who've gone before you. So Ingrid is one of our mentors now because she's back with another company doing it all over again. And that's what we help. And hopefully, please ask questions, but that's what this sort of, you know, environment, like one of the huge things that researchers at the university do is they try and get the technology de-risked as much as possible. And this is why the NIH funding is so critical. Because the minute you spin that company out of the university, you take the, you know, you form a company, you can no longer get like federal research dollars because you're at the university. You no longer have cheap grad students. So that's a very critical thing. So use as much federal money, you know, and this is why this matters. These are your tax dollars, right? Scott Galloway, who's one of my favorite professors at NYU, says, if you're a US taxpayer, you are a member of the greatest venture fund in the history of the world. Every dollar that we invest in early stage technology has returned 5, whether that's the Human Genome Project, whatever, but I digress. Anyway, that's how we help startups, and I would love to talk to you about it. So we create the environment that the Institute of Protein Design created for Ingrid and do it over and over and over again. He told me to tell a story.
Yeah. And dollar for dollar, I mean, those investments in that mentoring network is tiny compared to the the result on the back end, which is why we put so much focus on that. So fast forwarding, again, as Margaret said, 10, 20 years ago, had that research, but didn't really have that sort of commercial base of folks, had been there, done that. And as Emer sort of points out, in this industry, it takes folks that have done that to have the next generation of folks be able to do that. But that's led to really a robust, now we've got both Pfizer, BMS, and other large pharmas in the region that have built on that. So you've been, as you mentioned, sort of came here for Juno. Can you talk a little bit from a BMS perspective? It's sort of, the transition and built from Juno to BMS, and then sort of how BMS kind of thinks about the talent in this region, and then obviously what's progressing into an incredible manufacturing capacity here as well.
Sure. It's actually interesting with the video. Knew a number of the folks here because they initially started at Juno Therapeutics. So this area has been very rich in being able to recruit members into the startup. We all really appreciated what we were building. And we grew a couple of products. We're able to initiate clinical trials with these products. The key part that's been important over the past few years with the acquisition with Celgene initially and then Bristol Myers Squibb is that when we were just Juno Therapeutics with a limited amount of funding, we needed to only select 1 to 2 products that we would proceed with. And so it's been really critical for us to have gone through this acquisition process, both with Celgene and with Bristol Myers Squibb, where now we have the capacity to have a very rich pipeline of products that are in early phase research and have the capacity to then be manufactured. The other part, certainly with these startups, that a number of these companies will run into is struggles associated with manufacturing. As we think about the high costs of manufacturing, whereby we do need certainly a lot of capital to support clinical trials. These are extremely expensive studies as we think about specifically cell and gene therapy, where it's personalized medicine. And so being able to have funding, we initially had a partnership with Celgene, which is what led to the initial acquisition, where they sponsored us with $1 billion to support our clinical trials. And as we had continued to advance, they pursued an acquisition similar to the story that you just indicated, and thus enabling us to further and enhance our pipeline, which sponsored BMS to continue as well. So it's been very helpful to have this progression as we think about certainly acquisitions, companies taking interest in the work that the Seattle startups and companies are pursuing.
Can I just make a comment
Yeah.
on that? Because I think aside from like the innovation that really started Juno coming out of the Hutch and I think Sloan Kettering, the other aspect of it that was mind-boggling to me at that point, and maybe Mark, you can speak to it, that was I'm pretty sure Juno was the first Series A investment of like $400 million in a biotechnology company. And that really changed the game, because you can't, give $3 million in a Series A to a company that's going to be transformative the way it was. And now that's not as unusual. I mean, it's still a massive amount of money. But that, I think it was Arch Ventures that was also based here in Seattle that really pushed that new way of investing forward. And it turned out to be completely successful, and I think really a boon to this region as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the comment I would make is putting those pieces together. People always love to kind of pick and choose. Well, I like to support the research, but not the commercialization, or the commercialization, but not the manufacturing or the pharma side. And the reality is that it's an intertwined industry. You need the research, you need the early stage biotech to bring really challenging scenarios forward, and then you need pharma to be able to scale that, and that those monies all flow across that system. And so to advocate for the industry, you got to sort of support that whole supply chain, right? Not just pieces of it. And then I think, to your point, I think we've seen 2 big things over the past decade or so. One was that, and I'll come back to that, but one was what we said earlier, was just life science and biotech is a very, sort of everybody knows everybody industry. It's not sort of a monolith. And so really, you don't go to school to learn how to do, do all this, right? You have folks in the industry, you learn by doing. And so, as you said, for years we had very good early stage research-based companies, but they didn't really have the skill set to sort of actually transition that into commercial products and market. The medtech side had evolved a little bit earlier on that front. And so that's really what we filled in, and a lot of that happens through acquisition, right? Folks go through from a research company to get acquired to working in either a large bio or pharma, and then you learn this whole new skill set of like, oh, manufacturing matters, and how do I scale, and all that kind of stuff. And so really that is filled in over the past 10 or so years. And then Margaret, I think, sort of points out the second one, which is, again, and I think just for everybody in the room, just, again, think about the size of those numbers, right? I mean, I always say, sort of the American lore is you want to start a tech company, right? You get 3 people in a garage, you get a couple $100,000 or maybe $1 million, you write some code, you beta test it, send it out, see what happens, right? Our folks, your plan is, I need 15 years of research funding, probably 100 million plus, if I'm going to bring it all the way to market, several billion, right? So it's just a very different scale. And I think, oftentimes when we talk to legislators and others, people are like, oh, how hard is this? You just go start up money and you go. And it's like, no, in life sciences, it is a much longer time frame with much bigger dollar amounts. And Margaret sort of points out that other trend is that I think on the venture side and on pharma collaborations as well, people realize that putting in those larger amounts so that people really have the duration to build the right team, to bring stuff to market, to get through those initial, at least phase 1, if not phase 2 clinical trials, has really been important. So you've seen some of those bigger dollar amounts. Last year, just for reference, Zara, which was another spin out from the Baker Lab, its Series A, again with Arch and others, its initial round was $1 billion. Initial Series A funding, $1 billion. So that's, and that's on the larger side, so not all are like that. But for most folks, when you're raising 10 to 30 million initially and then hundreds of millions on follow-on. So it's pretty sizable. And again, Seattle does really well. I mean, we're not San Francisco, but we don't necessarily have all that venture money here. But what's changed is the venture community knows the science is incredible here. And so as I say, I mean, any good technology out of Washington is can get funded even if that money isn't local.
Yeah, and if I can just pick up on that one, part of the reason it's so expensive is because of the number of these drugs that fail somewhere along the pipeline. So the reason we started our very first cohort around computational health is that the idea, so just 5 years ago, Sean Nolan, who was the CTO at the time of Adaptive Biotech, he had come out of Microsoft. So, Microsoft made this very interesting, investment in Adaptive Biotech. So for us, that was the quintessential computational bio company. It was the first real one here. And not only that did Microsoft make a $50 million investment in Adaptive Biotech, they had about 8 to 10 of their MSR, their Microsoft Research AI ML experts resident at Adaptive helping them. And their whole point at the time was, what Sean said to me was, most of the bio companies in the city have no concept of the extent of their AI machine learning problem. And in just 4 years, that has changed dramatically. Everybody understands that. And the huge hope is not only so if you think about it, if you can simulate on a computer human biology, that really accelerates getting to a drug candidate that really will work. The dream is obviously that then you can do a lot more of that testing. The FDA already has guidelines around when there's going to be no animal testing. So that's why what David Baker is doing is so revolutionary, because he's one of the first people to really understand the power of computation. And Microsoft, again, made a major investment in David Baker's lab and has multiple Microsoft research. The unsung hero probably is Eric Horvitz, who's the Chief Science Officer at Microsoft. So that's what's unique about another thing that Seattle has that other sites don't have. Depending on the statistics, 1 in 4 AI engineers is based around the Seattle area. And this area, more than anybody, has been able to meld the two. And that's why we're trying to find these really innovative founders and help accelerate their progress, because hopefully we can get away from that, multiple $1 billion in 15 years to get a drug to market.
We hope. We've been trying to do that for 2 decades, right?
Like gene therapy was happening 30 years ago.
Right. Okay, so before we turn to sort of some of the challenges that we see coming up here, I want to go back to Evie just on one piece, which is just for folks in the audience, you touch on this, but talk a little bit. So the difference, we have sort of what we call small molecules and then large molecules. So small molecules, stuff you pick up at CVS and take it home, right? That what we think about. But Seattle, Washington, we do hard. We don't do easy. And so, we're not a big small molecule. We're really, again, these complex cell and gene therapies. And just, again, for folks that think, oh, you go to manufacture, you stamp on some pills and send it out. Just talk them through a little bit sort of what that manufacturing operation looks like in terms of, from patient to BMS manufacturing facility back to patient, the number of people involved. And all this, by the way, with BMS, at least with Breyanzi, but also others, invented here, manufactured here, delivered to patients here at the Hutch and UW. But just tell them a little bit kind of what that process looks like so they get a sense of how complex it is.
Sure. And for context, again, just filling in what cell and gene therapy is, it's considered personalized medicine, right? So we are taking patients to treatment centers and we're removing their immune cells, and these cells are delivered to BMS or other cell therapy facilities, and it's a whole process specific to that patient, right? And so we're taking patient cells. We are going through multiple days of manufacturing whereby we are really re-engineering these cells. We are allowing them to express new proteins. We are also having to scale them to a dose that is suitable for clinical use based on the outcomes of our clinical trials. And so this process takes orders of days. We're then having to support testing as we think about product release. This takes more time, right? And so it is a highly manual process for the majority of the industry. And so when we think about cell and gene therapy and therefore the fact that it's personalized medicine, this means that there are a lot of people having to support the manufacturing and release of these products, which leads to high costs. Not only that, the actual product, like the actual materials that we use to support the manufacturing of these, which we term bill of material, are also expensive. So as we think about considerations with tariffs and sourcing of these key materials, these do start to come at high cost when we attain these components from outside of the U.S. As just baseline. So this process largely continues until we're able to think about how do we start to introduce automation and how do we identify paths by which we can reduce costs. And so that's really starting to remove the human interface from this, starting to consider how do we multiplex and how do we consider new strategies to be able to reduce the costs from materials and such. And so because of the innovation associated with their cell therapy, it is, again, highly manual and highly customized to patients. The field, however, as we think about larger companies entering this space, is really targeted towards identifying strategies to reduce costs. And that in and of itself has its own challenges as well.
Yeah, so I always just like to remind people that everybody loves to pick up their stuff for a $25 copay, but the reality is that, to do that, it's just, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you've got literally hundreds of people as manufacturing facilities, literally taking patients' blood, like you said, for a week plus, right? It's really a challenging process. Again, hoping to drive those, like everything with innovation, you start there. And again, these are therapies that for the first time are actually curative, right? So these aren't you take them for the rest of your life, hopefully, not in every case, but we're now at the place where for certain cancers, you're able to take a drug and, within a period of months, it's curative. And so we're continuing, and then just, the next step is driving down those costs and trying to get this back to a place where, that whole supply chain is much more manageable. But just want to give that context. The point is, it's hard. Okay, so with that, let's pivot back a little bit. So again, life sciences, particularly on the therapeutic side, right, heavily regulated. U.S. has been, the global leader in this for several decades. Back and forth to Europe for a while. Really, landscape's changing is sort of China. If you go back 10 years, no molecules licensed to global pharmaceuticals, and sort of a non-player. right? Last year, 30% of all new molecules were licensed out of China. And that's because in 10 years, they have grown their research base and industry collaborations at a scale that I think, we just haven't ever seen before. I mean, I remember when I was a young staffer working in DC and we were like, oh, capital's mobile, but not talent. Fast forward to the world we're in today. So with that backdrop, policy matters, right? Because it's a regulated industry. You've got to run through FDA approval. It takes huge investments on the research. It takes a lot of, really hands-on work on the translational side, and then obviously a lot of work on the delivery side. So as the policy environment's changing in the United States, I'll let you don't have to focus on federal, but each should just talk a little bit about some of the challenges we see ahead, either on the big picture, or for some of our leaders and others, just at the state, are there some things we need to keep our eye on in terms of keeping the life science industry sort of at the forefront that it's been here for the last decade or so?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, if you want me to start talking about what's happening at the university, we could be here for a long time. No, but from an innovation perspective, from starting a company perspective, most bio companies or transformational companies, they start with some really bright postdocs. In general, faculty are not going to leave their job. David Baker set up an entire system to bring the most talented postdocs from around the world to his lab, and he's created an entire new discipline. If you see a TED Talk, anybody talking about protein design, look at where they got their PhD. It was at the University of Washington. So there's an entire generation of people. So my program, Creative Destruction Lab, is part of one at 14 universities around the world. Because, the NIH, distributed something like 1.5 billion less in, say, just January of this year, and 1.2 billion of the funding at the University of Washington depends on that. We're laying people off. David Baker is taking half the number of postdocs into his lab this year. Not only that, because they're a world leader and one of the only places in the world where you can really learn how to do this, every single person in his lab is being targeted. So for instance, Creative Destruction Lab just started CDL Milan. To make Milan, I think they started a $200 million, hoping to be a $1 billion fund called the Technology Europe Foundation. Number one goal, get all of the European scientists, entrepreneurs, everything funded and back in Europe. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's one. And that matters because this is where the people who are creating the Junos and the Celgenes and all of these companies are coming from. And the fact that China is advancing at the speed, a lot of these scientists are Chinese. They go home, they got infinite money, and they can replicate a lot of what has been created here very quickly. So it's just vital that we keep the funding to create these people. And also you've got to realize that the entire venture capital industry depends on these great founders as well. And money's fungible. It'll go to where the startups are going. And if they're not here, the money will just follow them.
Completely agree. And I mean, the other part of that is that talent is global. And if you look at where so many of these researchers are coming from, it's not necessarily the US. And the current environment is scary. So if you're already here, you're probably thinking that you might not stay here after you graduate, if you can actually graduate because of the visa issues and all that type of thing. And you can't go to if there's a conference outside of the country and you're on a specific visa, you're afraid that you might not get back in. Personal story, we learned this morning to tell personal stories. I met my husband in graduate school. He's from India. If we would graduate now, I don't think we would stay here. I mean, because the pathway is just too fraught. And that's what a lot of the young graduate students and postdocs are thinking about is where can I best pursue my research? That's what they care about. I mean, people like Evie are so focused on impact and how their science can change lives forever. And you're going to go to the place that will give you the resources and the stability to do that. And that's what's so sad is the United States has spent decades building this amazing lead in being the world's best place to do research, and it seems to be crumbling before my eyes.
Yeah, I'll build on that just a little bit. So I mean, having worked in DC first half of my career, I mean, for 30 years, there's been no debate in terms of funding fundamental science in this country. It's been a bipartisan issue. There hasn't been dissent. There's been some issues around sort of translational, how to fund that historically. But I think Margaret's point, this is sort of from a PNWER perspective. I mean, right now you have a lot of blue states that are out advocating for federal funding under the premise that more of the big, research institutions are in those states. But the reality is this hits every single state, right? I mean, the American system was built post-World War II, not as a central federally funded research institution in Washington, D.C., but to have our scientific enterprise spread throughout the country at research universities throughout the country. And right now we just, it's one thing for universities to speak up saying we need funding. But the reality is you need a broader set of voices. So, we're putting a lot of time into that. I'm working with colleagues in other states. But folks need to hear that from a broader set of folks from all states, right? This impacts any university, any research institute. Because if we don't maintain that base of scientific funding in the US, all those other pieces begin to fumble. And I just worry that right now, there are so many other issues that people are worried about. By the time folks sort of pay attention to this, I mean, we could wake up and basically see this entire industry having sort of collapsed or moved to China and Europe. So, it's a big deal to sort of engage in the short term, even if it's not big new investment, just maintaining what we've got. Because as Emer pointed out, I mean, you think about a Baker Lab where, 10 in just the last 5-6 years, right? 10 companies that have all spun out, brought several $1 billion into our local ecosystem. And that was just that doesn't happen without having that research infrastructure in place. And it's a time a lot of folks don't want to speak up, and more folks need to be able to speak up. That you've got to keep that fundamental infrastructure in place for all this other stuff to happen. With that, I'll sort of turn to. I was just thinking about sort of again as we think forward in Washington, where again we've built sort of this unique, really advanced manufacturing capability, but oftentimes as Emer from Ireland, right? I mean, historically, the trend has been, hey, we chase kind of low-cost places to do scale-up manufacturing. You go to Ireland, you go to North Carolina, Texas, that kind of thing. We've built this, not because we're cheap, but because we do really advanced work here. So maybe just a few thoughts on sort of what it may take to sort of sustain, the leading position that we've developed here over the last decade or so on the manufacturing front.
Right. So as we think about continuing to advance here, as I've stated multiple times here, it's all about costs, right? As we think about again, being able to bring products to patients, as you were indicating, these products are not necessarily drugs that we take continuously. These are potentially curative therapies, and so being able to provide access has been critical. Now, the U.S., while we produce many of our drugs here, specifically for cell therapy, one of the challenges that we continue to face is being able to support patients outside of this country. Our costs, again, because we are manufacturing in the U.S., are still very high, and thus prevents us from being able to support therapies in regions. We think about Latin America, we think about various parts of Asia where it is too costly for us to be able to actually support patients there as well. So as we think about global reach and support, the capacity to be able to ensure that materials that we use are at a cost that patients can eventually afford. Just from a statistics standpoint, again, these therapies are curative. They take many tens over hundreds of thousands of dollars to manufacture, and are therefore sold for high costs because of the cost associated with that. So opportunities there for us to further reduce costs become critical. To also follow up on what some of the panelists were discussing about, I'll speak more on the consideration of the FDA and the agency as we think about drug approvals. Specifically for myself, I work in technology, and so it's still, we see that it's critical both for the actual products, but also for the technologies that are utilized to make the products. So with the agency, we are when we think about new technologies and innovation, we need to be able to have discussions with the agency to be able to understand, are we going the right direction? If we go too far this direction, are we risking the ability to support approval later on? And so we need to be able to have regular touch points. And so with the current environment where there's just less members within the agency, we are seeing delays in communications back and forth, longer delays as we think about meetings, as we think about new technologies. And so it does have, I think the current environment certainly has implications as we think about funding, but it also has key implications as we think about being able to provide drugs to patients and being able to support innovative methodologies for supporting these drugs as well.
Yeah, and can I just pick up on Evie's point here? So I was at a global meeting of Creative Destruction Lab in Toronto 2 weeks ago, and we had representatives from the Canadian regulatory, I can't remember what their names are, but they were talking about the number of their colleagues that have just disappeared at the FDA. And everybody hates regulation, right? Well, my mother was pregnant with me in Ireland when thalidomide, one of the most deforming drugs ever, was on the market. Now, fortunately, she never took it. It was never distributed here because of the FDA. So, that's my story about why the FDA matters and the fact that we're guttering, this regulatory agency and inhibiting like major companies from innovating because they don't know what the path forward is, because they can't get anybody to even answer their calls. It's criminal. It's just.
Yeah, and it's an interesting industry in that sense. And I mean, largely, the U.S. and the FDA has always been the gold standard globally in terms of both safety and development. And the industry welcomes that. It's one of the few industries that doesn't, we're not scared of regulation. We welcome that because it ensures patient safety and ensures that folks are comfortable taking medicines. And so you want a robust system in place as long as it's predictable and provide some certainty and that kind of thing. And so, again, across all those pieces is really important to sort of maintain that. So we got about 20 minutes left. I want to leave about 15 minutes here for Q&A from the audience. It's a small group. I talked to the team earlier. So rather than using the WOVA app, just raise your hand. We'll bring around a mic here. So just before we do it, just any closing thoughts from the panel on thoughts going forward, and then we'll kind of open up for some
Q&A. Just one or two things quickly. Like why innovation matters, right? As I said, our mission is to help people commercialize technology for the betterment of humankind. So one of the companies that came through our program, amazing scientist, and basically she figures that she has like a urine test to predict bladder cancer. Okay, why does that matter? My next door neighbor died of bladder cancer 3 years ago. If you're a woman, and even a guy who's had bladder cancer, the test for recurrence is a cystoscopy, which is basically a painful procedure every quarter for the rest of your life. Mike Nash, one of my friends, has had 20 of them in the last 12 years. Can you imagine if there's a urine test for that? It is life-changing, massive amount of procedures. Those are the kinds of things that matter, and those are the kind of things that we're helping. So what would something like Creative Destruction Lab do for somebody like that? Well, one of our mentors was Mike Butler, who stepped down as president of Providence at the time. It's one of the biggest health systems in the country. He was able to get her a meeting with the executive team at LabCorp because at the time he ran, the hospital association. Those are the kinds of things that are just completely changing for companies. And those are the things that the Life Science Washington WIN program and Creative Destruction Lab do. And that's why, I think that we have an important part in the ecosystem.
So I guess I'd like to focus, since this is on the Pacific Northwest region, just trying to advocate that we continue to be creative if we have to about how we can have the cross-border collaborations. I know for BRI, we have collaborations with UBC and with other universities and institutes within Canada, and those are critically important. And right now, NIH is stopping federal sub-awards, so we have to try to push back against that and figure out a way to not get around it, but to find other solutions. But it goes beyond just therapeutic life sciences to plant life sciences. I used to work for an ag bio company, and we had offices in Saskatoon as well as some of the other provinces. And those were critically important because there's so much strength, in North America proper that we need to figure out how to continue to collaborate and work together to improve our world.
Yeah, I made this flag. I see Matt's in the back there. This is kind of recent development just this week. We sort of heard this kind of threat coming, but it was a little bit sort of amorphous. But this concept that we would do sort of, global leading research without any global collaborators, maybe driven sort of by the China context, but when Canada gets caught in that, like that's a big problem. So that's something we should probably put on the agenda to sort of work on, because that's a big deal.
And just finally for myself, when I think about the Seattle area, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here. When I think about the various startups, again, a number of the folks within the video have moved on to being CTOs or CEOs of various startups here. What we have seen certainly is for the various startups, a continued struggle when it comes to funding still. Where there are a number of companies, let's say over the past 5 to 10 years, number of startups associated with the support of various diseases and indications that have experienced significant job loss as a result of just change in funding for them. And so we do see that we do see a redistribution of talent in this space. Folks are needing to leave the state as they're losing their positions here. So I do want to continue to just ensure that this area has the funding it needs, not only for institutes, but also for the many startups that are imperative within this region.
Yeah, and a little context, on the chart when we started out, life sciences tend to be counter-cyclical. So if you look at that chart we had at the beginning, if you look over several decades, every time there's been an economic downturn, right, the economy goes down, life science and healthcare tends to either maintain or go up, which has been a nice counterbalance, in terms of the regional economy. That said, what Eva just pointed out is the challenge is that sort of the funding cycles for life science, are again big, right? So I mean, I think in 21, $5 billion came into the state. So we do an annual early stage investment report, and so $5 billion came into the state pre-public companies, all startup early stage companies. $5 billion, and then I think last year was down below $1 billion. It's come up a little bit. And normally that cycle kind of bounces around every 3-4 years, but we're now on sort of going on to year 3, 4, and 5. And so when you combine the current market cycle along with federal research cuts and those other things, it gets real challenging. So again, Seattle and the state of Washington has held up really pretty well compared to the regions. But I think it's one of the things, sort of the headwinds here is, how much longer can you sustain that with all of those things happening concurrently? And so we spend a lot of our time working on that. With that, let's open it up to questions from the audience here. And just maybe a quick shout out, I see we got Keith back here from the Commerce Department. I think Jeannie had worked on the Life Science Discovery Fund. So there is just a little bright spot there. Again, doesn't cost a ton, but some of the monies that were revenues that came back from the Life Science Discovery Fund, again, these are investments in companies 10 to 15 years ago. Those companies are just now bringing those products to market. And there is a little bit coming back there as well. And so it looks like there'll be a little bit of money in the queue that'll help maintain that kind of mentoring network and some of that work in the short term here over the next year or so.
Okay, maybe I'll start. I'm not even sure how to ask this question, but it's, I come from a rural community, like the biggest town's 32,000, and I live in one that's got 4,500. And the reason I came to this is, the impression I had is we started with nothing or very little and grew into this big thing. And now it's got the critical mass, it almost grows just because it's here, right? And so I'm trying to get a handle on how that got started. You talked a bit about it, and how does rural fit into this? Is it just impossible, and it's always going to concentrate around the big universities and research? I do have a college in my constituency, but it's and they do a little bit of research. But I just I'd like to spread it out a little bit, and I don't know if that's even possible. So I just thought I'd ask that question.
Give me a second, you guys want?
So I think this is where collaboration becomes really important. So way back in the day, one of the collaborations I had was with Washington State University, because it is a leader in bioenergy, and another company that was more focused in the Tri-Cities area. And so there are strengths around the state, I think, that kind of are able to produce leading positions in different areas. I heard earlier today that the dairy farm tour is going to include an anaerobic digester, which of course is really critical for a lot of the bioenergy work that goes on. So I think it's, can you necessarily be the next Pfizer location? Maybe not, but I think biotechnology is a super old industry. Like, has anybody had beer or wine? That's biotechnology at work. And so I think, finding the application that makes it work in your community is necessary, but it's, collaborating with different groups around the state or the country or, the world helps with that, because there's really intriguing technologies that come through.
Yeah, I make 2 points. I mean, on the bigger scale, I mean, it's a long-term investment. And so, for years, we've also supported work in both Vancouver and then Spokane. And as we saw from the video, I mean, Spokane has been investing over 20 years, right? I remember coming out to dedicate the first building, and then slowly that campus grew, added the next campus, added a med school, right? And then companies have come out from there. And so I think over the last 2 years, we had some funding. We had done some work supporting early stage companies through, doesn't matter, but the Accelerator program at that point. And when that funding went out, over 40% of the funding went to companies outside of King County. And so there's more out there than you might believe. In terms of like a super rich, dense cluster, tends to be around, some sort of research base. But as you point out, I spent early part of my career at PNWER and Battelle and Tri-Cities, the national lab there. And obviously, as you point out, I mean, a lot, whether it's for clean tech, whether it's for ag, whether it's for others, the fundamental science underneath all of those that support our ag industry and clean tech industry, as well as human health, it's the same science that comes out of those fundamental bases. So as Margaret points out, the application, those get applied everywhere. In terms of sort of having a dense set of companies around a research institution, there's sort of two different strategies there, but both are important.
And I'll just add coming from the pharma side of things is also recruitment and being able to identify locations where you can attract talent. And so and even in Seattle, as wonderful as this location is, we still struggle there with folks wanting to move across the country for this location. So as we think about being able to grow in areas that are more rural, I think that's the challenge that we will continue to run into, is how do we attract not only talent, but the best talent to these key areas.
Yeah, and the other thing here is, so remember, the WSU Medical School is really only, 4 or 5 years old in terms of first class. So, we've had a number of conversations, and we see that as a huge opportunity. Whereas UW really focused on sort of breakthrough science and therapeutics, right? WSU Med School is really focused on delivery in rural communities. In the initial years, we've just been trying to scale up docs, nurses, right, practitioners to go out into the field. But the next piece is you connect what they're doing there with then the deployment of innovative technology to hopefully lower the cost, increase access in rural communities. Huge opportunity that, again, very few other states have sort of a dedicated focus on that. And so if you're a company, and this is where it probably wouldn't be a big therapeutic, but if you're a digital health or a delivery or a telehealth kind of company, man, I would love to be able to come to Washington, have access to that statewide network of all those rural clinics and hospitals and points of delivery to be able to put in that first new technology. I'll just give you one example, because it doesn't always need to be huge. We did our summit last year over in Spokane, and just a local company that you go into a 1 or 2 person clinic, and you've got the practitioner that is doing intake, doc seeing patients, but then dispensing whatever the medication is on the back end. Well, that's basically a half a person's time. So the company just basically automated that process. So you basically have when the script goes in from the doc, you just walk out the front door and it dispenses your meds. So you take half of that person's time that can now either see patients or do intake and not have to do dispensing. So it's some of those small things that, that's a great little business. It's not a new cancer therapy, but it has a huge impact on patient lives. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical. I mean, one of the things I worry the most about is you look at what we've done with Medicare, Medicaid funding, and others. The ones that are going to be hardest hit, I mean, the big med schools have issues on grant side, but on delivery, the rural clinics and delivery, it's just going to be an incredibly challenging next, 5 years or so. So, really thinking about in that environment, how can we innovate to, have lower cost, increased capacity to help some of our rural clinics and providers be able to either stay open, or to do more with less is going to be absolutely critical. So I think that's a huge opportunity going forward.
And yeah, we have a question back here, and if people don't mind, just giving your name and your organization for the panelists. Thanks.
I'm Sarah Daniels. I'm with the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. I see you. And so a couple of things. One on the, obviously we're a very small population jurisdiction. And the University of Saskatchewan's sort of reach across the province is pretty broad. So just on the continuing topic of how do you get small communities involved in an innovation ecosystem, and I think the university has spent an awful lot of time thinking about it, but also the government, and I think that's the public policy piece where there are some incredible opportunities put together by the provincial government to get innovation, agricultural innovation, into the hands of producers. And I think it's really interesting that that model, that thinking that public investment in innovation, even from a small population jurisdiction, can make huge differences in productivity and innovation. And so you see that Saskatchewan's a massive exporter of all sorts of agricultural products. And so the next thing on our list is life sciences beyond agriculture into the health space. And I think that that's really interesting, but it's also in the early stages of the strategy for the province. And so I'm just thinking as this conversation goes on, how do we build the networks enough beyond what we already have, which is all around the university, because we have the Vaccine Infectious Disease Organization, which is a really big institute that has a big footprint in the world. Anyway, that's a terribly meandering kind of statement, but just interested to see how at the start of this strategy, your thoughts on going from agriculture to life sciences and how those lessons might be applied. I don't know if that might be impossible to answer, but.
Mary, you're a Saskatoon expert.
Well, that's a little heavy. So I think this was an agricultural biotechnology company, and we ended up having offices in Saskatoon, in I think Ottawa, and maybe even Newfoundland. And it was because the provinces made it easy for us at the time when there was not a lot of investment in ag biotech to, support the company. We had to set up a Canadian subsidiary, but the get was that you had to keep people in the province and have employees. And it worked really well because each site specialized in something. So I don't know if that same type of model could work in therapeutics. I mean, it seems like it could, but it would be up to the provincial governments, I guess, to set aside the funding for that type of thing to work. But, from my perspective, it really was very successful. The company, the technology ended up not being very successful, but, from a investment model perspective, we had a number of Canadian investors then, as well as the governmental support. And, and I think from thinking creatively around ways that you can collaborate so that, the funding is coming from both from both countries, but the science, technology doesn't have borders, right? So, if you can figure out how to work together creatively, I think there's probably a there.
Yeah, and I'm less familiar with the provincial system, but I would say, I mean, it's a weak spot in the U.S. in that, and obviously, again, Northwest is really well positioned. So UW is run, sort of operates across the WWAMI region, which is all the PNWER states plus a few. And so that infrastructure to serve the Northwest is already there. But it is a gap. Like, we don't have a good funding system to do sort of rural provider, because you would need support for those rural providers. And to my previous comments, they're the ones going to be hardest hit in the environment going forward. But that might be a little bit of an opportunity. I think that's one of the areas, I think with the current administration, there's a real desire to redirect some funding that has gone traditionally to the big urban centers into some of the rural areas. And so coming up with kind of might be an opportunity to kind of put up a creative proposal on the table to think about how to get some of those dollars into rural communities to do some of this innovation, which has been a gap historically, and would love to see that. I've been a big advocate for that. Would love to see that change. And if folks had ideas, love to talk to you and think about how we might put something together. My thought is the province might actually be a little bit ahead of the states in terms of ability to sort of do some of that work, just given historical funding. But I'm, again, a little less familiar. Other comments?
There are more questions online if you want to look at them.
Oh.
On Hoover.
Yeah. So first question, how do we decide on life science? I guess sort of from an economic development standpoint, I assume. You want to tell me, you want me to do it? Sort of how it got started. The short answer was back in the 90s, sort of biotech was the hot economic development kind of thing. And I think, again, the state put a real emphasis on that in that, actually, just before me, but at Battelle had put together a big study of Bio 21 and did, what was that, Margaret, maybe a 2-year endeavor?
At least 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, at least 2 years. So brought together leadership from the research institutions, from the industry to really think about what it would take to build this, issued a major report. Went to, I guess then it was Governor Locke. Well, Locke was still in office, but Gregoire was one that sort of picked it up. And then that's what led to the Life Science Discovery Fund. Which again, it goes back to investments in UW medicine back in when Senator Magnuson was here. So the foundation was here, but again, it was an intentional sort of point of the state that we were going to make this one of the key industries. Again, not huge investments, but strategic investment.
Based off of the tobacco money.
Yeah, well, yeah, and then the state used. So once that study was done, sort of identified the kind of to-do list. Then Governor Gregoire, who was the Attorney General before that, took the money from the tobacco settlement and applied that into the Life Science Discovery Fund, which was, I think, nominally supposed to be a $30 million a year fund. I think in practice it tended to be about 10 to 15. But again, it was the strategic commitment that I think really, and I think people can't underestimate that. So many in public policy, people think about what's the dollar amount, how much does it cost. They miss the point that it sometimes, and I think that's what Governor Gregoire said in the video, it's the fact that sort of just people made the commitment that sends a signal to the executives, hey, this is a priority for the state. And that makes as much difference as the money sometimes. I mean, you need both. You can't just do one without the other. I'm looking at Jeannie over here. But it's not about having the biggest dollar amount, but it's having that baseline of commitment there. I lost the...
I was just going to mention we're about at time,
Okay.
so
so
if there was any closing comments you guys want to provide. One thing I wanted to add to, I know you mentioned WWAMI. Just for everybody in the room, the acronym stands for Washington, Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming is in there. So, just for reference, it's a program at UW where they help train medical professionals across those states. So.
Okay, unless there's any closing questions, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody. I hope you had, Matt, go ahead. Wait.
I just want to say this was fabulous and it should have been in the plenary. You guys are amazing and the message is so vitally important. So everybody in the audience, please tell everybody who missed this session how significant it is. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And thank you guys for a great job.